So my paper today, I think, should be regarded as a light aperitif to get things underway before the more substantial fare to be offered first by Simon and then by other speakers later in the day. I am something of an interloper here, a gate crasher at the party, if you like, because I confess I'm no expert on William Temple, although I am eager to learn. But as an ecclesiastical historian of the 17th century, I do know a fair amount about William Laud. Laud is mentioned twice in Christianity and Social Order, and it was Jeremy Carrette who suggested I consider these remarks from the perspective of a 17th century specialist. Laud appears at the start of chapter 1. What right does the church have to interfere? When Temple is challenging the assumption of his readership that the church exercises little political influence and ought to exercise none. This view Temple describes as entirely modern and extremely questionable. Temple uses the example of Laud as a great mover and shaker in politics, but also one who made his mark on economics, as an opponent of engrossing and enclosure, quote, a friend of the poor with a genuine passion for justice. Laud is Temple's first example to demonstrate that the church has interfered and should interfere in wider society and exercise a moral voice in business and economics. So, Temple argues, if the church in 1942 was claiming to be heard in politics and economics, quote, it was no usurpation, but a reassertion of the right once universally admitted and widely regarded. Laud also makes a brief appearance in chapter 3. Has the church appeared to intervene before? When Temple suggests that the unbounded economic individualism associated with Calvinism helps us understand the hostility that Laud faced in his attempts to check the encroachment of landlords and enclosure. So I think Temple's remarks on Laud gives us two things to consider. The relationship of church and state on the one hand, and the character of Laud's social ethics on the other, and why Temple may have been drawn to him. I'll take these two themes in reverse order. First, though, it might be best to outline the career of William Laud as context for what follows. Laud was from a mercantile background, which may be significant for what I'm arguing. He was born in Reading in 1573, educated at St. John's College, Oxford. He became president of St. John's in 1611, bishop of St. David's 10 years later in 1621, in the last years of James I's reign. But his standing and influence was transformed by the accession of Charles I in 1625. So he became Dean of the Chapel Royal in 1626, a Privy Councillor in 1627, Bishop of London in 1628, and finally Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. He was a very busy councillor and given a wide range of responsibilities. He served, for example, on the subcommittee for trade and for foreign affairs. He sat on the commission for depopulation. He was briefly First Lord of the Treasury in 1635-6, and also Chancellor of Oxford University and Trinity College, Dublin, both of whose statutes he reformed. His central objective was the reformation of the British churches, England, Scotland, Ireland, to be achieved through the regulation and suppression of Puritanism, the introduction of ceremonialism in the church's worship, what sympathetic contemporaries called the beauty of holiness, taking the phrase from the psalmist. And importantly here, the rebuilding of the wealth of the church in an attempt to recapture the authority and status it had enjoyed before the Reformation. Laud was a force of nature. Having edited his Correspondence, I was struck by the industrial scale of his letter writing. The projects, both large and small, that he could pursue simultaneously, ranging, for example, about the whole status of the Protestant stranger churches in England, on the one hand, and the leasing policy of Exeter Dean and Chapter on the other. And Laud was remarkably efficient, effective, and consequently feared, because he enjoyed the unqualified backing of his Supreme Governor Charles I. Alongside his tireless energy, Laud could be graceless and confrontational, and indeed Temple notes his petulance and arrogance. Laud's reformation of the British churches collapsed in 1640 with the fall of Charles I's personal rule. And Laud was a necessary scapegoat, imprisoned in the Tower and largely forgotten, only to be hauled out, tried, found guilty and executed in 1644 to 1645 by his enemies in Parliament in the midst of civil war. Laud has been the centre of much lively inquiry over the past 50 years or so from scholars. His theology, was he an Arminian? His close working relationship with Charles I, who ran the church, king or archbishop, and his influence on the Church of England after his death. But his social teaching has almost entirely dropped out of sight. In Anthony Milton's otherwise excellent account of Laud in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Laud's social ethics gets about 200 words out of a biography of 10,000. So here's another reason, I think, to look again at Laud's views on society. Temple's account of Laud was derived most immediately from the influential work of his lifelong friend, R.H. Tawney, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, published in 1926, which Temple cites in the footnotes to his comments on Laud. Tawney, in turn, drew on 19th century writers and tempered some of their excesses when discussing Laud as the champion of the poor. This depiction, I think, had reached its apogee in 1895, when W.E. Collins edited a collection of essays to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the execution of Laud. It included a piece from the London Times, which noted Laud's sincere regard for the welfare of the masses and his awareness of the oppression of landowners. According to the Times, Laud took measures to better the position of labourers employed by the state and seamen pressed by the Royal Navy. Collins expressed his own admiration for Laud. Quote, "The large-hearted primate had views and ideas much in advance of his time. The good of the people at large occupied a place in his thoughts immeasurably greater than in those of any contemporary statesman. Laud deserves to be commemorated as, among other things, a true forerunner of the social leaders of our own day." C.H. Simpkinson, a Balliol man, incidentally, spelt this out in his essay in the same volume. Quote, "He remains the reformer par excellence of his day, the chief advocate of the working classes, the defender of the poor, the leader of the educational movement, an administrator who endeavoured to exterminate the corruptions of the civil service. Laud strengthened the position and influence of religious teachers in England, quote, but principally in order to educate the ignorant, feed the hungry, protect the orphans, and defend the weak." So Laud is here presented as the Christian socialist avant la lettre. So what is this all based on? I think the best summary of Laud's social morality remains chapter 3, the Church of England, in Tawney's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Tawney drew attention to Laud's public opposition to enclosure and depopulation at the council board and in Star Chamber, where he habitually pressed for the highest fines. Laud condemned one engrosser who'd held back grain in times of famine in order to allow the price to rise, by quoting Isaiah as grinding the faces of the poor. In correspondence with the Warden of All Souls, Oxford, Laud stated unequivocally that he was a great hater of populations in any kind, as being one of the greatest mischiefs in this kingdom, as well as a very ill example from a college or college tenant. He won the reputation of putting aside hierarchy and rank, so that transgressors, whatever their social background, receive the same blind justice from the law. The evidence is by no means complete. What were Laud's views, for example, on usury? But there's enough here to make a coherent whole. Tawney's account was largely adopted by Hugh Trevor Roper in his celebrated biography of Laud of 1940. And I'll be interested to know if anyone present has evidence that Temple, busy man that he was, had the chance to read it. And Tawney's work is also cited in the various works of Christopher Hill, another Balliol man, but neither he nor Trevor Roper added much to Tawney's line. The thinking behind Laud's actions is best explored in his sermons. Just 7 survive of the many hundreds that Laud would have preached. They are dated between 1621 and 1631. And almost all of them were preached before king or parliament. Perhaps because of Laud's audience, they open up his views on church and state, as well as his views on Christian morality. The sermons articulate first a remarkably integrated view of church and state, a theme that reoccurs time and again in these 7 sermons. Richard Hooker, writing in the 1590s, had famously observed that every English person was both a member of the Commonwealth and a member of the Church of England. Laud pushed this much further by arguing that church and Commonwealth were so near in nature as in place. Quote, "For both Commonwealth and Church are collective bodies, made up of many into one, and both so near allied that the one, the Church, can never subside but in the other, the Commonwealth. Nay, so near that the same men which in a temporal respect make the Commonwealth do in a spiritual make the Church. Both would flourish together or perish together. The Church can have no being but in the Commonwealth, while the Commonwealth can have no blessing or happy being but by the Church." So Laud takes the contemporary commonplace, the interdependence of church and state, and makes it central to his understanding for society. The sermons also identify threats to peace and unity. One were the Puritans. In a remarkable passage in a sermon of February 1626, Laud evokes a Presbyterian and Republican threat to menace both church and state, which underwrote his view that the two had common enemies. Laud also criticised those he called malcontents, those who preached policy without reference to morality, and those who put private interests above the collective good of society. For these, Laud had sharp words, quote, "For if any man be so addicted to his private that he neglecteth the common state, he is void of the sense of piety, and wisheth peace and happiness to himself in vain. For whosoever he be, he must live in the body of the Commonwealth and in the body of the Church. And if their joints be out, then how can he hope for peace?" Those who pursued such private interests were, of course, the depopulators, the enclosers, the engrossers, who privileged their profit over the common good. Another theme in the sermons was the importance of justice and judgment emanating from the king. As he wrote, "Does this mean the king must do it all himself? No, God forbid that the burden should lie all on him. There must be inferior judges and magistrates deputed by the king for this, men of courage, fearing God, and hating covetousness. The king's power, that is from God. The judges and the subordinate magistrates' power, that is from the king. But both are for the good of the people, that they may lead a peaceable life in all godliness and honesty." Laud here, I think, provides a nice self-cameo as a man of courage, fearing God, and hating covetousness. Laud himself was accused at the time of advancing the clerical estate at the expense of the laity by attempting to recover impropriated livings, whereby the laity profited from what Laud regarded as spiritual income. And also when he pushed for more updating of compositions for tithe payments. These have very often been settled in the 1540s and took no account of a century of inflation eroding their value. He was concerned at enclosures and depopulators who created the landless poor, and also by demolishing houses, they reduced tithe payments owing to clergy. In 1635, Laud told his Vicar General on visitation around the country to keep a special lookout for quote, diverse churches ruined by enclosure. Laud submitted annual reports to Charles I on the state of the province of Canterbury, and the problems of the poverties of vicars and curates was a recurrent concern, very often because impropriators settled too small a fixed income on the vicars. Laud in turn lambasted landlords both clergy and laity who put private concerns above the common interest. The royal instructions to the bishops in 1629 included a clause warning bishops not to fleece their diocese, just at the point that they were being translated to another see. As Laud noted in the sermon, sacrilege might be performed by the laity, but it was often with the connivance of the clergy. Corruption, covetousness, and simony were sins of both clergy and laity. At this point, we need to stand back a little to assess Laud's significance. His social views were conventional enough. As Temple rightly pointed out, Laud was no innovator. And they are close to the Commonwealth writers of Edward VI's reign, who railed against oppressive landowners and proposed a godly Protestant state free of abuses. And I'm referring here to the writings of people like Lever, Crowley, and Latimer. Having read Latimer's sermons, Charles Gore, yet another Balliol man, declared that Latimer was a magnificent Christian socialist. Nor was Laud alone in railing against enclosures, depopulation, poverty, and other social ills of his day. Sermons and treatises of the period are full of this. The difference, of course, was that Laud had a public office in which to enforce his views, working in a regime which officially at least broadly shared his social vision. Some of its policies, such as the Book of Sports issued in the early 1630s, were the work of others. But as he wrote, Laud felt he could preach more effectively from the council board or from Star Chamber than from the pulpit. The presence of churchmen at the centre of power in this period is more complex and is sometimes admitted by Temple and others. At the Elizabethan Reformation, bishops had been sent back to the diocese to supervise the introduction of Protestantism, and only one of them was elevated to the Privy Council, John Whitgift, in 1586. The mood music changed dramatically with the accession of James I in 1603. Here was a man who loved theological debate. He prized court preachers like Lancelot Andrewes, and in the course of his 22-year reign appointed 6 bishops to the Privy Council. One of them, John Williams of Lincoln, was also made Lord Keeper in 1621, head of the judiciary. In 1619, when he thought he was dying, James I confided to his heir, Prince Charles, that he should surround himself with bishops. They were the natural companions for monarchs. Charles was ever the dutiful son and followed his father's counsel. In his reign after 1625, no less than 7 bishops were appointed to the Privy Council. One of them became Lord Treasurer, William Juxon of London. In case you are reeling from information overload at this point, the view I want to propose is that Laud's ascendancy in the 1630s was not typical of the standing and influence of successive archbishops of Canterbury, even in the early 17th century. It was grounded upon a very close working relationship with Charles I, who trusted Laud to proceed against mutual enemies in church, state, and society. And time and again, the king was prepared to trust and be guided by his archbishop. Elizabeth's relations with her Archbishop of Canterbury had been much less harmonious. Charles's father James had fallen out with Laud's predecessor, Archbishop Abbott, as indeed did Charles I himself. So the notion that monarchs had churchmen in and around the court is true enough, with the limited exception of Elizabeth I. But the power and reach of Laud, founded on his intimacy with Charles I, at a time when the regime was broadly pushing the same ethical programme as Laud, gave him a voice and an influence unmatched by his predecessors or his successors in the post-Reformation Church of England. There's one final point I want to make. Temple suggested that churchmen exercised political influence in the post-Reformation period, and this was unexceptional, and implied it was uncontested. Interestingly, this is not the case on the eve of the English Civil War. The House of Commons got rather jumpy in the early 17th century when an increasing number of clergy, lesser clergy, not bishops or deans, were appointed as justices of the peace. This is partly social snobbery. They believed that magistrates should be appointed in terms of lineage and in terms of land, not in terms of education. In the 1630s, the prominence of bishops at court and council exacerbated these fears of the irresistible rise of the clerical estate, with Juxon as Lord Treasurer and Laud as an influential voice across much of government. The collapse of Charles's government in 1640 gave Laud's opponents their chance. Critics such as Lord Falkland in the Commons and Baron Say and Seal in the Lords argued that the secular responsibilities of bishops distracted them from their prime function of shepherding souls and preaching to the people. And it was this last point which led to Laud's remark I've already quoted, from prison that he was able to preach much more effectively at the council table than from the pulpit. In the political dogfight that preceded civil war in 1642, the removal of 26 bishops from the House of Lords would also serve the interests of Charles's opponents by removing an important bloc that tended to vote for the king. So in early 1642, bishops lost their seats in the House of Lords, and also all clergy, bishops included, were declared ineligible to be local magistrates. And this Act of Parliament was only reversed in 1661 on the restoration of Charles II. A very brief conclusion, and then I'll stop. In many ways, Laud's role and views were admirably suited to Temple's wider argument in Christianity and social order. The atypicality of his influence and the challenge it provoked are only minor qualifications to Temple's account. His view that the church should intervene in politics was broadly accepted in Laud's time, even if his opponents were able to enact legislation against this, which was a product of the unprecedented weakness of Charles I. Like Laud, it's been suggested that Temple cherished the view of the person in community because of the inherently social character of man, and Temple evidently felt comfortable with the traditional social ethic which Laud espoused. Thank you very much.